introduce Dr. Briana Pobiner, who is at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History and has been working at the interface of human evolution and also public engagement and education.
Excellent. So thank you all for sticking around till the end of the show today. It's humbling to share a stage with so many wonderful speakers, so I hope that I can kind of live up to what's come before. And also, so before I dive in, I want to take a moment to explain why I chose this photo for the beginning of my talk. And so this is a photo that I took from our traveling exhibit that we in the Smithsonian's Human Origins Program have been working together with the American Library Association to travel around the country to both public libraries and religious seminaries to try to bring the evidence for human evolution to audiences outside of Washington, D.C. So we have a permanent Hall of Human Origins there, but we recognize that not everyone can or maybe today wants to come to Washington, D.C. And if you're local to Nashville, hold on, there we go. Good news, so we're coming back. So 3 of us who are in the room, Lee Meadows, who you'll hear from tomorrow, Jim Miller, who is here, and I, and our 4th member of our away team, as we call ourselves, from the Smithsonian, Dr. Rick Potts, who's the curator of the exhibit. We'll be back here in Suwanee in the spring of 2026, when our exhibit will be at the School of Theology at the University of the South, which is just an hour and a half from here. So we'll be doing some public programs there if you want to hear more. Okay, so but back to the main focus of my talk. So what do we know about human evolution? What did we know about human evolution in 1925? So that's how I want to frame what I want to talk about regarding human evolution. What would Scopes have actually taught about in 1925 if he was teaching about human evolution? And what do we know now? And what questions are we asking and how have those changed? So what I'll do is dive into the fossil record as it stood in July of 1925, and then talk a little bit about just some examples of how much more we know at this point. Okay, so here is the first fossil of early humans that was ever discovered. And this was in 1929. This child Neanderthal skull was found in Angers Cave in Belgium by Philippe Charles Schmerling, who was a Belgian physician and amateur antiquarian. And so during the winter of 1929 to 1930, he discovered 2 early human skull caps that were associated with fossils like woolly rhinos and mammoth bones, and a couple of also flakestone tools. So this one is Angers 2. The first one that he found, Angers 1, is actually an upper Paleolithic modern human, Homo sapiens, but this one is a Neanderthal child. So he published a book about these finds. He passed away soon thereafter, and very few people were convinced that this evidence was important and meant anything about the antiquity of human evolution. And this fossil was actually not recognized as a Neanderthal until much later. But he's really still credited as the first scientist to have understood and even demonstrated the contemporaneity of fossil humans with large extinct prehistoric animals. So you'll see the age of this fossil is uncertain. We don't have really meticulous notes of where exactly in the stratigraphy it was found. The next find, also another Neanderthal, this was found in 1848 in Forbes Quarry at the Rock of Gibraltar by Captain Edmund Flint. And he was a British officer with the Royal Navy. He also happened to be the secretary of the Gibraltar Museum Society. He presented this find to the society in March of 1848. Again, didn't have a really excited reception, and so the significance of this skull as a better representative of an extinct human species was not recognized until September of 1864, when this was presented at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. That was after the next find, which I'll show you, which was in 1856, a discovery of a more extensive assemblage of Neanderthal remains. So it was in Feldhofer Cave in August 1856, in the Kleinfeldhofer Grot Cave in the Neander Valley of Germany, where Neanderthals get their name from, near Dusseldorf, where this fossil skull cap was found by 2 Italian workers mining limestone. And so the owners of this cave and also the owners of the quarry found out about this discovery. They collected 16 other skull and skeleton fragments from the mining rubble. They gave these to a local teacher and fossil collector named Johann Carl Roth, and he recognized them as something kind of human, but also not quite modern human. And so this fossil drew the attention of two professors of anatomy and bone in Germany. They examined the bones, and one of them, Hermann Schaffhausen, published their findings in 1858 and 1859. He interpreted these fossils as what he called antediluvian, so predating the biblical flood, and representing fossilized humans. So these findings, again, were not taken very seriously by scholars at the time, and some interpreted what was called their rickety bone changes to pathology or disease. One suggested that one of the skeletons found may have belonged to a mounted Russian Cossack who had roamed the area during the Wars of Liberation against Napoleon. But the find was published in a scientific journal by the other anatomy professor, Mayer, in 1864, and this fossil was then officially named as the type specimen for the new species Homo neanderthalensis, which really established paleoanthropology as a field of scientific inquiry. So next, in 1868, this famous fossil skull of an adult male of our own species, Homo sapiens, was one of several modern human skeletons found at the rock shelter site of Cro-Magnon, which is near the village of Les Isets in France. So the story of this find is that in 1868, road construction revealed this rock shelter that was tucked into a limestone cliff, and workmen found animal bones, stone tools, and some of these human skulls in this rock shelter. So French geologist Louis Lartet undertook excavations there, and the team recognized an occupation area or an occupation floor towards the back of the cave. And there were 3 early human individuals, early modern human individuals who were found. Cro-Magnon 1, this skull and partial skeleton, Cro-Magnon 2, which was an adult partial female skull, and Cro-Magnon 3, an adult partial male skull. And so it was the position of and placement of ornaments. They found pieces of shell and animal teeth fashioned into what looked like pendants or necklaces. And this led the researchers to believe that the skeletons had been intentionally buried in a single grave in this rock shelter. Interestingly, these skeletons show signs of a physically tough life with some traumatic injuries. So Cro-Magnon 2 has some fused neck vertebrae as well as a skull fracture. And then Cro-Magnon 1, this individual, has a fungal infection and a genetic condition called neurofibromatosis type 1, there we go. And so this is evident there's a depression in the frontal bone, and also there's pitting around the eyebrows and the cheekbones. This probably would have led him to have large tumors or cysts on his face. And it suggested that the survival of these individuals suggests some kind of care and support from their social group, kind of allowing injuries to heal. Okay, so what comes next? Next is a few more Neanderthals. So in 1886, these 2 Neanderthal skulls, Spee 1, which is an adult female, Spee 2, a young male, were found during the excavation of Spee Cave in Belgium, conducted by a Belgian archaeologist and geologist. And then later on, paleontologist and zoologist Julien Frépont published the specimen description in the Journal of American Anthropologist. So by the mid to late 1880s, we have a handful of fossils. We have growing evidence for this new species, Homo neanderthalensis. So in 1891, we get finds from a different geographic area. This Homo erectus skull cap, called Trinil 2, along with Trinil 1, which is a fossil molar tooth, and then later in August 1892, a thigh bone, were found at the site of Trinil, which is along the banks of the Solo River in Java. And these were found in Indonesia by Dutch physician Eugène Dubois, he was initially in Indonesia with the Dutch East Indies Army as a military surgeon, but he was really interested in looking for fossilized human ancestors. So this fossil was later nicknamed Java Man. It was the first early human fossil remains found outside of Europe, and also at this point were the oldest known fossil human remains ever found. In 1894, Dubois named a new species. He first called it Anthropopithecus, and then Pithecanthropus erectus, meaning upright ape man. This was named after these specimens, and he thought they were different enough than what had been found before to place them into an entirely new genus. So these Pithecanthropus fossils were so immediately controversial that by the end of the 1890s, almost 80 different publications had already discussed them. Later on in the 1950s, German biologist Ernst Mayr reclassified Trinil II and the other fossils in Trinil, along with fossils from China, originally called Sinanthropus pekingensis, or Peking man, all together with the species Homo erectus. Next, in 1907, near Heidelberg, Germany, sand mine worker Daniel Hartmann found this mandible in a sand pit just north of the village of Mauer. He recognized it as important because after the well-preserved skull of a straight-tusked elephant had been found at this site in 1887, for 20 years, German scientist Otto Schoensack had the workers taught the characteristics of human bones and asked that they be encouraged to look for fossils. So they did find these early human fossils, and then he described the type specimen of Homo heidelbergensis and proposed this new species based on anatomy that looked a little bit more primitive than the Neanderthals, but still generally human-like. This is the last fossil that was discovered before the Scopes trial. And so in 1924, in a local limestone quarry, there was a quarryman working at these Buxton Lime Works in Taung, South Africa, who found this skull. He then showed it to Edwin Gilbert Izod, who was the visiting director of the Northern Line Company. Izod gave it to his son, Pat Izod, who displayed it on the mantle over the fireplace in his house. Thankfully, a friend of the Izod family, Josephine Salmons, who was the first female student of paleontologist and paleoanthropologist Raymond Dart, who was an anatomist at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, thought, well, her mentor is really interested in fossil monkeys. He might be interested in this skull. So she brought the skull to Dart. 40 days later, he completed a paper that described the fossil and named the new species Australopithecus africanus, meaning the southern ape from Africa, and described it as, quote, an extinct race of apes intermediary between living anthropoids and man. And this paper appeared in the February 7th, 1925 issue of the journal Nature. So, not too long before the Scopes trial. So this child skull was the first early human fossil discovered in Africa. It was really the first to draw major attention to Africa as a place of origin of the human family tree. Dart's claim, like some of the ones before his, were that the skull was a human ancestor was really strongly criticized by British scientists at the time, based on features of a then forgery called Piltdown Man. So Piltdown Man had a large brain and ape-like teeth. But the Taung child had a smaller brain and more human-like teeth. So it sort of contrasted the order in which what was known then as these adaptations had evolved, again, based on a forgery. However, clearly this fossil, this species, walked upright based on the placement of the foramen magnum, the large hole in the base of the skull that is where the spinal cord goes in. So it still took over 20 years after that before scientists accepted the importance of Africa as a major geographic focus of human evolution. So here's what we have in 1925 when the Scopes trial happened. We have kind of a handful of Neanderthal fossils from a few different sites. We have one site that has fossils of Homo sapiens. We have one site that has fossils of Homo heidelbergensis, one that has fossils of Homo erectus, and one that has fossils of Australopithecus africanus. So I will sometimes hear that, all of the evidence for human evolution could fit in a cigar box or on a coffee table. And maybe that was the case in 1925. And this is what the human family tree would have looked like in 1925. So Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis with a handful of fossils, one Homo erectus, one Homo heidelbergensis, one Australopithecus africanus. So what do we know now? We have a few more fossils now. And so really in 2025, the picture is totally different. So this actual picture was taken in the office of Rick Potts, who's the director of the Human Origins Program at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And he's the curator of our permanent Hall of Human Origins and the traveling exhibit. And this photo was taken by one of our museum photographers, Chip Clark, as we were working on and developing the Hall of Human Origins. So I was a member of the team that created that exhibit as well as the traveling exhibit. So Chip went into Rick's office, he took all of the books off the shelves, and he replaced them with the objects that would go into our exhibit. Most of these are replicas. We have a few original archaeological objects on the table. And so really now we have thousands of individuals of early human fossils that tell us about how our bodies and our brains and other aspects of physical evolution occurred over time. We have hundreds of thousands, probably millions of archaeological objects, of artifacts, of stone tools, of art objects that tell us about how human behavior evolved over time. And all of this evidence allows us to create a much richer picture of our deep ancestry than we could have even just 100 years ago. So this is what the family tree looks like now. And every paleoanthropologist might give you a different family tree, but I would say there's pretty good agreement that there's at least 20 species of early humans on our family tree. We know that the root of the tree with the common ancestor that we share with living great apes, so living great apes are not our ancestors, they're our cousins, but we share a common ancestor with them. We know that this root goes back about 6 or 7 million years. We know that from fossil and genetic evidence. And there are two whole groups on this tree that were not even discovered in 1925. The Paranthropus group, which is on the right, which is sort of this extinct side branch of human evolution. We also know that the oldest fossils on the family tree, members of the genus Ardipithecus and a few other genera, had not been discovered at that point. So you'll notice that I presented human evolutionary trees. So when our fossil record was sparse, human evolution was often thought of as linear, with one species evolving into another and only one species around at any one time. So this graphic depicts what we know about the fossil record of each species on our family tree now. And two things really jump out at me about this. One is that we're still here, we're the only species left, but we're not necessarily the evolutionary winners. So our species evolved about 300,000 years ago in Africa, and we know that from fossil and genetic evidence. But several other species on this bar chart have been around a lot longer than we have. So my hope is that we behave well enough that we can catch up to these species at some point. We'll see. It's also an unusual time during our lineage because we are the only species around today, the only kind of human. During most of our evolutionary history, there was more than one species of early human walking the earth, sometimes even in the same place at the same time. That's us up there. So I want to finish with two examples of how much more we know about species in our family tree. And I've picked two of my favorites. The first one is Homo erectus, and this is a bronze sculpture of Homo erectus from our Hall of Human Origins. It's one of 5 bronze sculptures of different early human species that was created by paleo artist John Gurche. And remember, in 1925, we had one fossil skull cap of Homo erectus. We now have a much more significant fossil record of this species, including several partial skeletons. So what do we know now about Homo erectus? We know that they evolved in Africa about 2 million years ago, and this is the longest lived species. It has the longest, that red bar on our family tree. It existed until maybe only 115,000 years ago, potentially overlapping with some of the earliest members of our species. We know it's the first early human species to migrate out of Africa, based on those remains found at Trinil and several other sites in Indonesia and other places in Asia. We know based on fossil remains that they're really the first species on our family tree to have a more modern human-like body size and shape. You'll see that this fossil, this individual, she's reconstructed here, is carrying an antelope on her back. So what is that about? We know based on butchery marks from fossil animal bones from the time of this species, including these fossils that are about 1.5 million years old, part of what I studied for my dissertation research on early human diets, that we know that this species is the first one to start incorporating more animal meat and marrow into their diets. They were successful scavengers of large animals. They might have even hunted some smaller ones, although we don't have really good hunting tools from that time. And we, sorry about that, hold on. I just mentioned hunting tools. The tools that we do have from around the time of Homo erectus are the longest lived stone tool technology in our prehistory. They're an innovation called Acheulean technology. So they're teardrop or almond-shaped tools that are called bifaces because they are flaked on both faces of the core of the tool. And this creates lots of sharp stone flakes. And we don't know what Homo erectus or the other species around at this point may have used these tools for. We often call hand axes or Acheulean tools the Swiss Army knives of the Paleolithic. We think they might have been used for digging. They might have been used for sharpening sticks. They might have been used for cutting meat off of bones, breaking open bones to get at marrow, digging up tubers. We also know a little bit more about Homo erectus behavior. So this is a fossil from a site where 5 Homo erectus skulls have been found in the Republic of Georgia in Indonesia, a site called Dimenisi. And this Homo erectus skull, you might notice that he has no teeth. So all of this old man's teeth fell out while he was still alive, and his jaw resorbed so much that we estimate that he was around for 7-8 years and persisted without having any teeth. That means his social group probably took care of him. They may have cut up his food for him. They may have chewed it for him and eaten it. And by the way, this skull is dated to 1.8 million years. So I think we can start to see the whispers of things like empathy pretty far back on the human family tree. Okay. And this is a sculpture of Neanderthals. And this is a Neanderthal mother and child. And so I want to talk about what she's doing and how we know that she did those things. So first of all, you can see she's squatting on the ground. So many Neanderthals have what are called squatting facets, which are bony projections in their ankles, suggesting that they squatted habitually, and they have other foot and ankle adaptations for stability during prolonged periods of squatting. You see she's holding an animal hide in her teeth. So we see slanted wear on a lot of Neanderthal teeth, and we even see scratches oftentimes on their front teeth. So we think that this means that they kind of use their teeth like almost as a third hand in order to grip materials, maybe as they are preparing preparing animal hides to make into loose-fitting clothing. And she's using a tool, kind of a punch tool, to create that clothing. And so a lot of Neanderthal sites have these tools called burins and other things that we think were used to make clothing, even if that clothing hasn't actually persisted. So what else do we know about Neanderthals? Just a couple fun facts. So they existed between about 400,000, maybe even 430,000 years ago, till about 40,000 years ago in Europe and Western Asia. They survived many glacial cycles, many ice ages. They buried their dead, sometimes with symbolism or ritual. They made sophisticated stone tools that they used to hunt big animals. They had rope-making implements. They made birch bark adhesives. They also ate smaller animals and even marine animals when they lived by the sea. They used red ochre pigments. They made perforated and painted shells. And they even wore things like this, eagle talons. You can see little marks on the top of those eagle talon bones. They wore them as jewelry. Sometimes they cooked their food. We think Neanderthals were probably the first species to have habitual use of fire. And sometimes they ingested medicinal plants that don't seem to have any, other good dietary use. And sometimes they actually ate each other. So Neanderthals practiced cannibalism. There are several investigations of Neanderthal cannibalism, including new investigations of those spee fossils from Belgium that were published in 2019. And like Homo erectus, there are examples of Neanderthals caring for one another. And so one of them is from a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, where 10 Neanderthal burials have been found. This one is an older male who clearly had a head injury early in life. And you can kind of see his skull is a little bit bashed in on one side of his head. And that was the left side of his skull. And so below that, you see his two upper arm bones, the humerus. The right side of his body is actually the humerus that's on your left side, and it was totally undeveloped. So the right side of his body was withered. He probably wouldn't have been able to get around very well by himself. And he lived decades after that injury to his head. So again, his social group probably took care of him. We also have great evidence from ancient DNA that Neanderthals interacted with us, interbred with us. So all of us in the room today carry a little bit of that legacy of Neanderthal DNA in our own genome. And another fun fact, so that original discovery of the Neanderthal fossils in the Neander Valley. So in 2000, after a few years, the precise location of those finds was relocated. Further excavations took place in the same area. I was a graduate student in the audience at a conference when it was presented that small pieces of skull bone that fit precisely onto that type specimen were found more than 100 years later. So if you think scientists aren't emotional about the things they discover, you could hear a pin drop in that room and just this audible intake of breath of excitement in recognizing that, we found more of that original Neanderthal fossil. So I want to tell you a final story, and that's about the Taung child specimen. And so the site where this skull was found has an unusual mixture of animal bones found alongside it. So they're mainly from small animals, things like rodents, tortoises, lizards, crabs, hyraxes, small antelopes, small baboons. And this is uncommon compared with the animal fossils that are found in most other sites with other early human fossils in South Africa that are mainly from much larger animals. Many of these small animal bones from Taung also have damage resembling that made by modern birds of prey, and eggshell has also been found in the Taung deposits. So you might see this little hole in the bottom of the eye socket of Taung, and so we now think that these marks resemble those made by a modern eagle's sharp talons and beak when they attack monkeys in Africa today. So now we think that the Taung child was actually attacked and killed by an eagle, and the animal fossils that are found are similar to the ones that are often found with other bird of prey assemblages. So Taung was found in 1924, published in 1925. When was the paper published with this new hypothesis? 1995. So it took over 70 years for scientists with the specific expertise to look at Taung sort of with new eyes, with new questions, and really just, new discoveries are happening all the time about the stories of our ancestors. So I want to end with an invitation for you to look into the eyes of these 8 forensically accurate reconstructions of early humans from our Hall of Human Origins, again done by paleo artist John Gurche. Sure, as scientists, we're interested in who these fossils were, what their names were, how old they were, where they were found. But human evolution is not just the search for dusty old fossilized bones and ancient artifacts. It's the pursuit of our collective past. It's a striving to understand the lives of those who came before us and how they shaped who we are today, and maybe, hopefully, where humanity might go in the future. Thank you.